My name is Mike Brazil. I'm an associate manager in finance operations on Google Checkout. And it's my pleasure to welcome Brett Johnson today as part of our Leading at Google series. For those of you who may not be familiar with the series, it's designed to bring in experts from around the world to help us learn about leadership and how we can apply it to our unique context here at Google. Just to give you a little bit of background on Brett, Brett Johnson is the founder and current president of the Institute for Innovation, Integration, and Impact. That's a Silicon Valley think tank that specializes in aligning corporations behind a compelling purpose that then drives innovation and results in sustainable impact. The Institute works with leaders and corporations to discover and implement personal and corporate callings in order to have a positive effect on society. Previously, Brett was a partner at KPMG, Pete Warmrick, and Computer Sciences Corporation. Before that, he spent 14 years at Pricewaterhouse, working in the United States and South Africa. He has worked extensively with leaders around the world and is the author of Lemon Leadership, Radically Fresh Leadership, which he'll be speaking about today. His first book, Convergence, looks at issues of work-life balance and the integration of all facets of life. Brett co-authored iOperations, the impact of internet on operating models, with Gary Deschamps, the former EVP of worldwide operations at Cisco Systems. He also has a few handful of books in the works. When life gives you lemons, you write a book. And to let us know more about his book, I'd like to welcome Brett Johnson. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. Appreciate the introduction. Today I'll be chatting with you a little bit about Lemon Leadership, and I will take questions at the end, although I'm happy to be interrupted. I was wondering, what if there were more than just two types of leaders? And you can do the search yourself. Some of you will be tempted to do it now. But the reality is, there are many descriptors of leaders out there. For years and years, I worked in executive information systems starting about 30 years ago. And our challenge was to design systems that were tailored to the way individual executives were wired. And so we try to get inside their heads and then figure out what would work for them and wouldn't work. But at the end of the day, when you went to the body of literature that was out there, you would have descriptors of dogs and otters and, Labradors and all sorts of stuff like that, and of course the discs and the Myers-Briggs stuff. But it all boiled down to two things: managers, this guy doesn't work at Google, and entrepreneurs. And occasionally you might find a third category of person, which was what we'd call a visionary. And a visionary in Silicon Valley, as you know, is basically somebody who has great ideas, but when the company gets going, you stick them in a corner office, you feed them the food under the door, and you hope that they don't come out and disrupt things. So, when you looked at the literature, basically it was entrepreneurs and managers is what you were left with. But in my dealings with leaders, I found that just wasn't enough in terms of the categories of people. So I began to do some research, work with people, understand their characteristics, and determined that there are actually 5 types of leaders. Now here, I'm not talking about styles, I'm not talking about preferences, I'm not talking about introvert or extrovert, or whether they're direct or indirect, concrete or abstract. I'm talking about how they're wired. Leadership DNA. And my contention is that there are not just 2, but 5 styles. Luminaries lead with ideas, primarily. They see the world through constructs of thinking, thoughts, long-term. Entrepreneurs are driven by opportunities. And managers are driven by policies, procedures, systems, structure. They understand organizational capital, whereas the luminaries understand intellectual capital, and entrepreneurs, real hard capital, finances, assets, and so on. Then you get organizers and networkers, and I'll chat a little bit about those. But these 5 types of leaders, and each one of us is a combination of these 5 slices of the lemon, if you like. Now, I'll put your mind at rest for the managers in the room. I was teaching this out at a university in Hawaii many years ago, and some guy came in the next day and he said, "I have just one problem with your model." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It should be called Melon Leadership." I said, let me guess, you're a manager, right? And yeah, I'll explain why the managers are in the middle in a moment. Yeah, so it's lemon leadership, not melon leadership, not venom leadership is if we had visionaries, instead of luminaries. But mostly we've been left with entrepreneurs and managers. And the sad part about that, if you remember the book, The E-Myth, there are many people who think they're entrepreneurs, but they're not. So if you look in college campuses, about 75% of people at college campus say they're going to start their own business, and down in the 30% do. And so the E-Myth says there's not that many entrepreneurs. In fact, you might be interested to know what are the percentages. And you guys are pretty data-driven. So here's the results globally first, and then I'll give you the Silicon Valley split as to what percentage we see out there based on thousands of assessments of leaders. So world population, 9% are luminaries. When you get the combinations, like what percent are luminary organizers, for example, primary luminaries, secondary organizers, the numbers will drop lower. But 9% are luminaries. Then about 14% only are entrepreneurs, pretty small number. Then managers are about 22%, and organizers 35%, and networkers 20%. The interesting thing about this is that in traditional leadership literature, we're missing half of the pie. Organizers and networkers are not even classified as leaders usually. So we need to see why that's a problem. Here in Silicon Valley, we have slightly higher percentage of luminaries, which is good. And then we have not much difference in the entrepreneur quotient, which is quite interesting. Of course, there's a confluence of factors here with the universities, venture capital, and so on that cause the entrepreneurs to have a better likelihood of success than if they were elsewhere in the world. But the percentage-wise is not much different, 1% different. We have a higher degree of managers over here, fewer organizers, and a lower number of networkers. Those are the guys who are in New York calling you at night when you're having your meal. That's where the networkers are. So you might say we have more nerds than nice guys in Silicon Valley, but as the saying goes, the geek shall inherit the earth, so that shouldn't be a problem. So let's look at this a little bit more. Of course, the issue is what do we do about the missing percent? So lemon is fresh. It's a little bit different. It's not about styles. It's not about what your style is. It's also not about your strengths and how do you just make the most of your strengths or your weaknesses and how to avoid your weaknesses. It's also not about what you do under pressure. So lemon leadership is radically different, and we'll get into that in a moment. So firstly, throughout the book, we have these lemon truisms scattered. And one of them is that you lead from your identity, not from your function, not from your personality, not from your style so much, or even your role, although it is possible for your role to squeeze you a particular way. I'll give you an example. I was down the road at a semiconductor company, shall we say, and most of the people in the room, directors, vice presidents, indicated that the CEO was a luminary entrepreneur, which he was, and they were paid just to do stuff. They weren't paid to think, basically. But when we got their lemon assessment results back, they had a smattering of people. And it took me about a half a day to convince them that they could do more than just implement what the CEO thought about last night. And so sometimes our function or our role will squeeze us into a particular way of operating. But here's another truism. If you work in a manner where who you are is consistent with how you're wired on an ongoing basis, you'll burn out. So we have to watch out for that. What I'm going to do is there's a chapter on each of these characteristics, luminaries, entrepreneurs, and so on. But I'm just going to give you a summary right now of all five and chat through those at just a high level. This is just an abstract of some of the things that are out of the book. So first, and this is, by the way, each of these on a good day. Each of us has good days and bad days. And here's a difference between lemon leadership and other leadership stuff that I've read. If, for example, you're going with color coding and you're a red leader, under pressure, you're bright red. You know, you're burning red. With lemon leadership, what I contend is that on a good day, you have the positive aspects, the strengths of your primary slice. On a bad day, you will exhibit the negative characteristics or the weaknesses of your secondary slice. So these are the lemons on a good day, and we'll look at them on a bad day in a moment. So, luminaries, they lead with ideas. They have sayings like, ideas have consequences. There was a Chinese chap and a Frenchman on a plane flying, and the Frenchman said to the Chinese guy, "What do you think of the French Revolution?" The Chinese guy said, "Too soon to tell." Right? Luminaries have long-term thinking, think about long-term consequences, and they can, on a good day, blend their passion and their principles. So they will connect with people. The person might be missing part of their faculties, but if they connect on ideas, they connect. And so luminaries embrace people who have the same sort of ideas as them. At a hands level, they can do stuff well first time. Second time, not so good. Third time, bit of a disaster. Okay. The entrepreneurs, we know a lot about entrepreneurs, but they're driven by intuition and opportunities. They are action-oriented. They can pull stuff together early on, and they generate a lot of excitement. You've probably met people here in Silicon Valley who will move from one company to the next just following an entrepreneur. What's he or she doing? I don't know, but I'm going because I think it's going to be fun. Entrepreneurs are sometimes more heat than light, but still people warm to them, they love them, and they can get stuff going. Managers. Managers are the folks that people love to hate. But the reality is many of the corporations, the bigger corporations, are run by managers. That's what keeps the board happy. That's what keeps things stable if you want a steady Eddie kind of environment. So managers, they're good at long-term planning. They're patient. You can give them a mess and they can fix it. Doesn't faze them. They understand the competencies that are needed. While a manager is building a team, an entrepreneur and organizer is just doing it themselves. But the manager's thinking, I don't want to have to do this a year from now, so they'll slowly build a team to get something done. And some people say that managers have no heart. That's not true. They connect with people through consistency. It might not be the brilliance of the luminary or the excitement of the entrepreneur, but through consistency. These are the folks who actually do your annual reviews on time. The other guys don't necessarily do it. You know, they'll talk about it. They'll think they've done it if they're a luminary. They imagine they did it. They sold somebody else on doing it, like Huckleberry Finn. But managers do it themselves. So let's chat about organizers and networkers. Organizers are highly intuitive. And here's the challenge with organizers. They're hard to spot because of their high level of intuition. They just do stuff. Give them an objective. Don't tell them how to get there. Get out of the way. An objective plus permission is what they like. And they don't like the rules, the structure, or the stricture of the managers because they can see how to do it without having to read the manual. And so they're highly instinctive, and they can also spot what's going to go wrong. So you can put something in front of them, and they'll say, it's not going to work. And you ask them why, and they'll say, I don't know, it's not going to work. Now, actually, in a moment I'll mention, let me just talk about it now. When you'll see the networkers are highly intuitive around people. They can come into a room, and they can look out, and they can see who's getting it, who isn't getting it, who's connecting. They're great communicators. They're kind of chameleons. In the first edition of the book, there's a section on how to communicate with different lemons, how to adjust what you say, the pace of what you say, the medium of what you say. With networkers, there's no advice for them because they do it automatically. It took some people a while to figure that out, so in the second edition, I've explained why that's the case. I didn't forget to finish the chapter. Networkers just know how to communicate. And the cool part about the networkers is they make you feel like you're their best friend. For example, a friend of mine was CFO out at Sears, and John Chambers from Cisco went to see him. And he says, Chambers makes you feel like you're the only customer, right? And you know it's not true, but you still kind of feel good when he comes around. Speaking about Chambers for a moment, you'll notice what happened with Cisco. They got to a stage in their business where they had gaps in their product line, And Chambers was the next perfect CEO because all he did is he went out and acquired companies to fill the holes in the product architecture. And he could do a $1 billion deal before you'd buttered your toast in the morning. A lot out of instinct and high networker. So networkers make you feel like their best friend. Of course, they have 279 best friends. They think that they're all actually their best friends. If you go on their Facebook, they're up in the thousands over there. Actually, we ran a lemon assessment recently, and a guy from Microsoft came to me, and it showed up that he was something like a manager or an entrepreneur or a luminary. And he came to me and he said, I think I'm a networker. I think I'm a networker. I said, look, the scores are accurate. You know, you're not a networker. But I have more than 1,000 friends on Facebook, he said. I said, let me go over. So I took him over to some real networkers, and I said, is this guy a networker? They looked at him and they said, no, you're not a networker. Networkers know who the networkers are. Okay, what I was going to say is a little bit about product development. In product development, there's often arguments about who's on point. Is it engineering? Is it marketing? Is it sales? Is it development? Who's carrying the ball at any point in time? You can scrap all of that so long as you follow the lemon sequence. You've got to have luminaries involved up front. Then entrepreneurs to figure out if anybody's going to buy this thing. Then managers to actually work on the build. Then organizers to see what's going to go wrong. So you put them in the test function. They like to break stuff. And networkers to see if anybody will buy it. Doesn't matter which department they come from. I'll give you a practical example. A company in South Africa was asked to put together a curriculum around HIV/AIDS for the government in South Africa. And they were given the project with a fairly short timeline. Now, ordinarily, what they would have done is take a manager, get the project manager, begin to build out the team, and it would have been a long project. It would have been about a 4-month project by the estimate. What they decided to do, because they'd come to understand lemon leadership, was switch things around, and immediately they put a luminary on the team. And the luminary scanned through lots of other curriculum that was out there with an entrepreneur. So they had a luminary and an entrepreneur first. Then they got a networker to see if the rough ideas would be bought by anybody. Then they added a manager to bring stability to the team, and they delivered the project in 7.5 weeks. And the client said they'd never seen anything like that before. So just getting the right mix makes a huge difference. Moving along, this is a quote from a guy who's a manager. You can see by the length of the quote, it's not a very whiz-bingy kind of quote. He's a nice guy, but he's a manager. You know, when he got married, he had a spreadsheet. You know, the potential fiancée, she had to kind of, you know, get the scores up, and it was a systematic approach. Okay. All right. Doesn't sound romantic, but she is married. Okay. Let's talk about the weaknesses. On a bad day, the luminaries narrowly focus on their own ideas. They get stuck on something. You've met them, right? The technology changed 10 years ago. They're still beating the same dead horse, you know. Then, at the hands level, they can easily become disconnected from the organization. So, luminaries think they've given a clear handoff. You know, I had this idea in the shower, and I just thought we should do this. If we strung that together, put that with that, got it? Right, I mean, there's just... It's so vague, it's 50,000 foot level, and then you're supposed to pick it up and run with it. So they often disconnect there. And if you don't track with their ideas, they'll just hit the eject button and find somebody else who does like their ideas on a bad day. The entrepreneurs, they can chase stuff that are non-existent opportunities, not real opportunities. And one of the things about entrepreneurs is they don't have failures. They just have learning experiences. That's what they call them. So they don't learn from their mistakes. And they can also fake it on the skills front. Managers don't like to fake it. They like to at least have one skill. I can do finance. I can do project management. Entrepreneurs and some of the others can do anything. And then they'll go and figure out how to do it afterwards. Okay. Managers, they can sometimes lack spontaneity. The other thing they can do is they can become a little bit rigid. You see, here's the deal. Managers write the manuals, like the HR manual. You go along and you say, I'd like to take vacation to go to the Bahamas and then visit my cousin over here. It's like going to look like a 6 week thing. And they say, Paragraph 43, subsection 2, says you can't do that until you've been at Google for 9 years. And you didn't even know there was such a thing. Now, hint for the other people. The managers write the rule books, but they don't necessarily keep them themselves. On a bad day, they just know when to bring them out just to beat on the other people. Okay. Organizers. There's nothing that an organizer hates more than a calm pond. So they get their excitement out of fighting fires. So if there isn't a fire, start one, right? So when you go along and you've got a project that's going fine, who needs an organizer? So they'll just create an issue, right? And they'll just raise a problem. If you've been out of the office for 3 weeks and you want to know what's going on and you got one phone call to make, like off the island, call the organizer. Because on a bad day, they're like the office Velcro. All the dirt sticks to them as they go through, and they can tell you exactly what's going on. And that's the counter side of their intuition. So a little bit on the networkers. They can have a poor reality index. And I should mention the reality index briefly. The managers are at the middle because they have the best grasp of reality. They're dead in the middle. I remember one day I was at home, and my son was sitting at a computer looking at a picture of his sister. Off to the other side was my youngest son, and my wife, Lynn, was making an urchin outfit for him, for Oliver, for the play. So he's dressed in rags. I was exercising, which consisted of pulling a rope over a door, through a pulley, a mechanism designed for astronauts because there was no gravity up there, so they needed something with resistance. And my middle son announces, "This family is whacked." And my wife, who's got a lot of networker in her, networkers like to be liked, she was aghast. "What do you mean? What do you mean?" I said, hold on. "James, explain to me, what do you have in mind?" He said, "Well, I see every picture of my sister. She's smiling, but she's the most complex person I know." Then there's Davy, who has no defense because he's wearing the rags. And then he looks at me. I'm also, in a precarious situation. I said to him, "James, you think you're the only sane one in the family." "Yep." Now, he's the Air Force pilot. He's the jock. He's the 97% left brain, steady Eddie, and he thinks the rest of the people are wackos. And that's the way managers see things. Their view of the world is reality, and out in left field are the networkers, luminaries, and out in right field are the networkers, and they're somewhat right. So, this is just a quote from one of our companies we worked with and from somebody at Cisco. I'm going to move right along. We have a lemon assessment. It's pretty simple. We tick 75 spots. You don't have to write anything. No handwriting analysis, no references from your doctor. All you do is put in the X's, and we run the analytics, and what pops up is somebody like Ned Morgan, not his real name. He's a networker manager. Okay? And what you understand about this person is when you look at their profile, you'll get a sense as to how they think, what their time horizons are, how they hear things when you speak to them. I'll give you an example in a moment. You can also stack up the scores for a department. So this department is fine if you're in customer service. If this department is R&D, you got a problem because they don't have enough on the luminary side of things. Obviously, you have to weight the data for teams, and you can see somebody might be high on scoring themselves and somebody might be low, but you can weight the data for the teams. The other thing that we look at is, what are the primary and secondary slices? So in a room such as this, if you ran the assessment, there would be some people who are primary luminaries. So over here, 4 primary luminaries and 3 secondary luminaries. We were working with an executive team once, and out of 40 plus execs, not one primary entrepreneur. Another company we worked with, this was in Indonesia, they had a head office staff of 120 people and a field direct sales staff of 250,000. And they had one entrepreneur in the head office, and out in the field, close to 250,000 entrepreneurs. You can imagine what the problems are going to be. They speak a different language. They do different things. So we had to teach the head office folks how to speak like entrepreneurs and networkers. You can't change how somebody's wired, but you can change the way they speak. So the next day it was quite cute. We had some of the corporate office staff in, and the execs were manning the phones. And there was the product development lead, VP of product development, who is a luminary, talking like a real schmoozer on the phone to somebody out there because he figured out how to speak their language and connect with them. So let me give you a simple example. When you ask somebody, is the project done? And they say to you, it's finished. What do they really mean? Well, you better know who you're talking to. Because if a luminary says it's finished, then what he means is, I've thought about it quite a bit. You know, I might have written a white paper. I emailed a few friends. Conceptually, there's nothing standing in the way of this thing getting done. It's quite conceptually possible. In fact, it's as good as done. When you say to an entrepreneur, is it finished? And they say, oh yeah, it's finished. What they mean is, it's like one of 5 things that I'm working on at the moment. If it stays up close to the top of the pile, I'll probably push it through. But if a better opportunity comes along, you're dead. I'm not going to finish it. Now, when a manager says it's finished, what does a manager mean? It's finished. Yeah. Otherwise, they'll tell you it's 95% complete, and over the next 2 weeks, if you give me additional resources, I'll finish it. That's what the manager says. Now, when an organizer says it's finished, what they mean is, it's about 70% done, and that's all I'm going to do. I'm not going to do any more. Because the other 30% for an organizer is a complete waste of time. It's the last, like 20% of a project that takes 80% of your resources. They learned that by instinct. So when an organizer says it's done, we moved office once, and the whole move was planned by 2 organizers. I was in Hawaii. I got back, and it was incredible. The whole thing was done in 2 days. Except that when you leaned against the cubes, they weren't attached to the wall. Everything looked like it was in place. So I waited a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I figured at some point somebody's going to bolt the brackets to the wall, connect everything, finish up all the stuff. I was deluded. I had 2 organizers working on the thing. From their perspective, it was done. The phones worked, the printers worked, that's it. Networkers. When a networker says it's done, what he means is, I got a friend. My friend has a cousin, Billy. And Billy knows a lot of people, and those, I have 5 people who could easily, and if we had a party and brought those people over, probably it's not done. It's not even close to done. So that's the way the networkers think. So you got to know what you're thinking about. So when you're speaking to somebody, you have to figure out, how do they speak? How do they hear things? How do they communicate? So that you can put the communication in the right context. Okay. We had a situation with one company, a large, huge IT organization within a large insurance company. And I saw during the day-long discussion that 2 people were kind of looking at each other. Clearly, there'd been past issues. So I invited them up for a role play. They agreed. And one was a luminary organizer, luminary entrepreneur, and the other was a manager organizer. And the guy, I said, replay what happened. He said to her, I got this great idea for a new business. It's a brilliant idea. It's going to be fantastic. Don't worry about the details, he says to her. I said, pause right there. I said to her, what did you hear when he said, don't worry about the details? She said, I heard, there aren't any details. Yeah. So I said, what was your response? She said, well, give me the functional specs and the business plan and the cost-benefit analysis. I said, hold on. Mr. Luminary, what did you hear when she said that? Oh, you may as well have told me to walk on nails, jump in the fire, pour cold water on myself. It was like the kiss of death. We went back and forth, and I tried to get them to speak each other's languages, which they did. Eventually they killed the project, and it was a new business opportunity that they killed. But here was the telling thing. I asked the manager organizer, what probability of success did you put on this venture? I'd asked him the question first, luminary entrepreneur. He said 85%. She said 0 to 1%. That's the gap when we don't understand how people are wired and we don't adjust the communications. Okay, so I'm not going to speak about all the communications overview. Just to say before I take some questions, that there's multiple branches to the lemon tree. There's the lemon basics, your characteristics, strengths, weaknesses, how you're wired, what you do for work. There's also lemon communications. I hinted at that. Product development is another one. If you're in HR, how do you make sure you hire the right people? Here's the thesis. On any major project or on a leadership team, you need all 5 slices of the lemon. The problem is, we hire people who are like us, for the most part. We had a company in Texas brought in a new VP of compliance. You can guess she's a manager. And what did she want to do? Fire all of the non-managers because they weren't like her. Who did she need to turn the place around? Not the managers. She needed the entrepreneurs and the organizers. And so hiring is important. Team building, some other facets to the lemon tree. Now, just to sum up from a different angle, the lemons care about different things. So what do luminaries care about? They care about ideas. Why? Why? The entrepreneurs don't give a hoot about why, because ideas are a dime a dozen. You can get those, just go up the road to Stanford or whatever. You know, you can get tons of ideas. The question is, can you turn it into an opportunity? And so they care about what and then when. The managers care about how. Any fool can come up with an idea, but can you actually implement? Things haven't begun until there's a plan. Now, organizers, they care about tasks and crises. They care about when, what. So the best solution for an organizer is the quick solution. And they like, when you're talking to an organizer, they always want to bring things to a close. They hate loose ends. I know some organizers who can't go to bed at night unless their unread email is less than 1 screen. Whereas that doesn't bother the luminaries. They have hundreds of them, right? Networkers, they care about who. Look, they don't like people more than other people, but they understand the people dynamics. They understand that kind of relational capital. So in summary, from your friends at Wordle, that's the summary of the whole book. And, oh yeah, here's a little quiz for you. You've got it if you understand how to ruin the day of a lemon. It's pretty easy. How would you ruin the day of a luminary? Any suggestions? Oh, yeah, give them a lot of details. That'll be good. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so long as they don't have to do too much, they wouldn't mind being there for a while. Okay, how else would you ruin the day of a luminary? Kill their ideas. Yeah, there's a better way. What else would you do? Steal their ideas, right? That's great. You can kill it, but if you can just take it, put your name on the white paper, right? They've slaved there and 3 years thinking in all their Google spare time, come up with stuff, and you just say, I got a few friends over here. Can we kind of add our names on there? We had a guy who lived with us, an intern, and then we had a second intern, and the intern would compose these flowing reports and send them back overseas, and number 2 would just take them, change a few names, and send them off again, right? So you can ruin a luminary's day by stealing their ideas, right? How about an entrepreneur? How can you ruin their day? Okay? Steal their opportunities. Kind of great. You put a sales guy onto an account. Okay, you're responsible for this. And they work 6 months. They get to know everybody, their birthdays, the dog's names, everything. Get the client in and you reassign them, right? That's a great way to ruin. Managers, you can mess with their systems, right? Just for the heck of it. Now, managers actually believe that other people understand systems and just don't obey them just to get up the manager's nose. That's what managers really think. But for the managers, I got to tell you, the networkers don't even see the expense reporting system unless they're really desperate for money, you know? And so, organizers, take away their leader. You've heard take me to your leader. Organizers are most satisfied when they're supporting a leader, often in the background. But when you put a manager between the organizer and the leader, you ruin their day. That's what happens in Washington, D.C. These people you've never heard of, they get a manager between themselves and the president, and they write the kiss and tell books, you know, about this president or that president. Networkers, how can you ruin a networker's day? Isolate them. That's a cool thing. Yeah, they love to be with people, right? Networkers have an uncanny ability to connect the dots. You're a normal person and you think, they'll come to you, they'll say, oh, Gene, you got to meet this friend of mine in London and the other guy in Houston. If the three of you get together, I know. See, networkers have this belief, if we get enough smart people together in the room, then a miracle's going to happen, you know? No agenda, nothing, very exciting for the networkers. And the fact is, they're intuitive about that. I hired my first intern. He was a networker. He came to me and he said, oh, I've got this friend. I met him playing soccer and this, that. But this was his second opportunity. His first opportunity was so flaky. Some guy in Florida doing some harebrained thing. So the second time he came, I didn't even listen to him. 18 months later, Michael Yang sold my Simon for $685 million. You know, we could have had a piece of that if I listened to my networker. So, okay. So that's it. I wanted to let you know that we do have some books here, and we're running low on the first edition, but just for you guys, within about 24 hours, as soon as Amazon gets their stuff together, there'll be a second edition up on Kindle, just to let you know, black and white and boring, but there you go. So that's the story. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take questions at this point. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, you mentioned some of the other, Myers-Briggs and colors and some other things.
Yeah.
How did these 5 styles track to those? Is there any similarities? Or?
Yeah, I see them as a complement. Okay, so the repeat of the question is, what about disc, Myers-Briggs, colors, dogs, otters, lions, bears, all that kind of stuff? How do they fit in? And the reality is that I tell people that this is a complement to those things. This isn't about styles. So you can be an indirect manager. You can be an abstract or a concrete luminary. You can be an introverted networker. And one of the things that I have to catch myself doing is not judging a book by its color, not saying, oh, she's introverted, so she can't be a networker. I really have to run the tests to see. Or he looks like my friend who's a manager, so he's a manager. No. And so at the back of the book over here, as you go through the book, you can build up your own composite profile. And so I've got a way to build up a profile, and at the bottom are some of the complementary things. So I see it as a complement, not an instead of. It's pretty simple to understand. There's a VP friend of mine who's head of product development at a company down the road over here, and he sat down with his 5-year-old and 7-year-old, and they talked through lemon leadership. And what they talk about is it fair for the parents to discipline the 2 kids the same, because one's a luminary, one's a manager, you know, and stuff like that. So a kid can get it quite easily at a basic level, and at a more complex level, you know, there's other layers to it. Good. Other questions? Going once? Alana.
Another communication style.
Yeah, sure. The issue of communications is that you'll be able to spot somebody somewhat by the way they communicate. Now, a friend of mine actually has come up with the concept of lemon bait. So if you're in a room like this, you're dealing with a group of people, you don't know what they are. So he throws out a bit of luminary bait, this research thing that somebody's been working on in Google, and the screensavers go on. Nobody bites, you know? Then he throws out something about an opportunity. If we did this project together, we could, you know, joint market and collaborate. Nothing, right? Then you throw out and you say, our policies and procedures, this is our budget, our timelines, and all the lights go on, you're talking to managers, right? And so, so in the communication pieces, you can see over here the content, the format, in other words, the media that they use, the way in which they express things, whether they talk about issues, opportunities. When I'm talking to somebody, I'm looking out generally to see when their eyes light up. When I talk about ideas, do they light up? When I talk about issues, do they light up? When I talk about people. For example, the language of networkers is stories. So if you're talking to networkers, you've got to talk stories. You know, they cry during the dog commercials. All this. They love a story. They love an underdog, an overdog, any kind of stuff. They love, so long as there's a story over there, right? Managers like facts. So if you're a salesperson who's a networker and you're trying to convince a manager and you tell more and more and more stories, the credibility index just starts going down because the manager is thinking, this person doesn't have the facts, right? If you're a luminary and you go in and somebody doesn't buy what you're saying, you know, you just make the vision bigger. You make it the searches intergalactic, you know. You make the response times sub-milliseconds rather than, and so you throw more vision at it rather than giving the person exactly what they need. They just want to know what's the start date, end date, resources, or whatever. And so on the communication front, you can see by the way that people communicate. If you have a short amount of time with somebody, you can pick up verbal cues which will tell you how they're wired. And that can be a super useful thing. And then what you have to do is rotate the lemon. As a leader, you have to figure out what does this situation call for? Because you might be a manager networker and the situation calls for a luminary entrepreneur. Rotate the lemon. It'll hurt a little bit, but you can do it. This is a huge difference between lemon leadership and other stuff where we say, avoid your weaknesses. I'm saying no. Each of us can make an adjustment. The only thing that's going to stop me behaving more like one of the other slices is actually me thinking my slice is better than their slice. All lemons are equal, but some lemons are more equal than others. That kind of mindset will stop you rotating, you know. And I'm saying on any team, even if you're missing, you look at your team, there's 6 of you in a row and you're missing an entrepreneur. You can all put on your entrepreneur hat and say, how would an entrepreneur look at this? How would an entrepreneur communicate this, etc. Good. One more, yeah. Yeah. Okay, so are there combinations that pose more challenges than others? Yeah. Well, at a broad level, if you're developing people, or if you are one of the hardest challenges is the growth path for an organizer because they're so intuitive. They function so highly out of intuition. So how to get them to grow beyond their intuition is a challenge. It's also hard to follow organizers when they're at the head of a corporation. Jack Welch, for example, when he took over at GE, I think he was an organizer entrepreneur. And his vision was pretty simple. Number 1 or number 2 in any market, otherwise you're out, end of story. But at least he communicated that clearly. If you're functioning highly off intuition, a bit of a challenge there. Other combinations, no. There's no right or wrong answers. You just have to understand your primary and secondary slice and make sure you know when you're having a bad day. Because when you're having a bad day, you can see you begin to function out of the negatives, the weaknesses of your secondary slice, and you just have to make adjustments. That's super helpful to me. On a good day, I'm a bright luminary, good ideas, and so on. On a bad day, I'm the manager from hell, right? And, you know, and I know what they should be doing, and I nitpick. I don't build people up. I don't foster them. I just kind of get nitpicky on the details. But if I know I'm having a bad day, I can go off and get a latte, do something different, go take a walk or something, you know. Yeah. I had a husband-wife combination. He's an expert, both of them, in Myers-Briggs, DISC, and all of that stuff in another country, so I can talk about them. And they run a leadership development institute. That's what they do. He's a luminary organizer. She's a manager organizer. The problem was they were about to become a statistic of couples that couldn't work together. Why? She thought she was doing all the work, and he was just having ideas. And then they would have a bad day, and they would both be in the negatives of organizers. Now what they do is, they'll go play golf if they're both having a bad day. They'll stop the work. It's a waste of time. And they've figured out how to complement each other and get the job done. Good. Alana, I think we're done on time. Thank you very much.